Hello and welcome to the MLS Fantasy Insider. Our preview of round four of the 2025 MLS Fantasy season is brought to you by Early Season Fatigue Management. What is that about? Is this the NBA? Are we doing this, guys? Really? Messy? Actually, it's brought to you by our amazing MLSFI Patreon supporters. Because of your support that we're able to keep this project going, head over to patreon.com/MLSFI right now to see our updated support tiers and find out how to get in line for our Pro Rel League. I'm your host, Matt Wojo from the content team at MLSFantasyBoss.com. I'm here filling in for Reid, who is celebrating his anniversary tonight with Lady Boss. Happy anniversary to that happy couple. And Ashley, who did suffer a non-contact knee injury that we're speculating to be from something embarrassing and potentially age and or gracefulness related. She would not share that with us. So feel free to make your guesses in the chat. I want to see what you guys think Ashley did, how she did her knee in. So we're wishing her a speedy recovery, but we really want to know why. So tonight we're joined by our special guests, Brian Mauer and Blake Eshelman. They're the hosts of the Dropping Points podcast. Thank you for being here, guys. How are you tonight?
Doing well, man. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, man. We always love talking fantasy with fellow fantasy content producers, and so there's not a lot of us out there, right? So ultimately, we want to get to know you a little bit. I've been following your work for a little while now, but for those of us in the MLSFI community, Fantasy Boss community, who are not familiar with you, we want to get to know you a little bit before we dive into looking back over this past weekend. So, how did you get into MLS fantasy, and what's your experience playing the FMLS game? Blake, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go ahead and start. So I was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, one of the cities that has an original soccer team in Major League Soccer, the Columbus Crew. So I grew up going to those games. So I've always been involved in Major League Soccer, a supporter of the Columbus Crew. And as I got older, went to college. I went to college kind of far away, and I still followed the Columbus Crew, but I kind of fell out of love with the league, I guess. But after I graduated college, me and a bunch of my buddies were like, "Hey, let's get into MLS fantasy soccer." So I got into it probably in 2015 or so, and it was just a really good way of staying in touch with the league and staying abreast with that and seeing what's going on, and then showing that you're smarter and better than your friends at using the numbers and trying to outscore them on a weekly basis. And it's been really fun, especially over the past couple of years. I remember Brian and I have talked on this show, like when Miguel Almiron came to Atlanta United, that was one of my favorite MLS fantasy years. And that was, just a few short years after I got back into the game in 2015. And since then it's been nonstop. It's been so much fun. And it's only become more fun as the league continues to expand. Better players are coming to this league. So whereas it was just a nice little hobby, now it's turned into a thing that Brian and I do on a weekly basis, man.
Yeah, and I got into MLS fantasy because of our show. I had been playing fantasy sports for, I mean, since I was a little kid, probably 9 or 10, mostly NFL fantasy, a little bit NBA fantasy. And when I started getting into soccer content as a part of Top Bin 90, covering Charlotte FC, we had Blake Eshelman on, because I remember when Charlotte first became an expansion team, Blake had Ben Bender on his podcast, MLS Gone Wild, at the time. And so that was my first introduction to Blake. And I told Jorge Gonzalez, who I work with at Top in 90, that we should have him on when we have at the time it was called MLS Corner, and we wanted to bring Blake on to cover the Columbus Crew when we were having when Charlotte FC and Columbus played. And then the year after that, I was like, Blake, we should test this thing out in terms of MLS fantasy content, and we went with it. And 3 years in, it's been an absolute blast. But for MLS fantasy soccer's perspective, I'm actually pretty new to the game. I've just been in the game for 3 years, but have been doing fantasy sports for 20 some years. And so when it comes, and that's why I think the numbers for me, because you're using whether you're playing whatever the fantasy sport you're playing, I mean, it's just a matter of adjusting how you approach looking at it, whether it's because at the end of the day, for me, a lot of it is looking at the gambling odds. What does Vegas think? What are the stats? What are the underlying numbers that lead to points, right? And so for me, that's kind of how I got into MLS fantasy, was just covering soccer in general and knowing that I could apply some of the skills that I had from covering other sports and following sports and kind of just applying it into a new direction.
So as far as the podcast, the Dropping Points podcast, so was it you that approached Blake about it? And Blake, if so, was that how did you feel about that, about the fantasy perspective of MLS? Because you had been working with like MLS content itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, Brian was the one that approached me with it. Like Brian had said, we had kind of formed a MLS relationship through his work over at MLS Corner with Top End 90, and they'd reached out to me a few times, and we always had a really, really good chat. Yeah. And about that same time as when my time with, not my time with, because I still run MLS Gone Wild on Twitter, but the podcast itself was kind of dying out. I lost a few hosts. Apple TV was introduced, and my podcast, if you guys have not listened to MLS Gone Wild, primarily was player interviews and personality interviews. After Apple TV came in, it became increasingly difficult to get those player interviews, which meant I had to pivot kind of how I was doing content. I didn't have a co-host at the time, and it was, a little bit overbearing trying to do a whole show by myself or look for guests on a weekly basis. So while I'm no longer doing those super fun player interviews and that sort of content, Brian reached out to me and, kind of tickled my fancy when it came to fantasy sports and just kind of nerding out about MLS in general. So it was kind of a perfect timing thing. And it's been awesome ever since. I'm super glad that Brian and Jorge and the guys over at Top End 90 came up with that idea. And I'm super thankful they thought of me when they were coming up with that.
Yeah, I think it's just for me, it was also just wanting to figure out how to make more content that's interactive for the fans. And I think that's what, I mean, Matt, you mentioned this at the top, like there's not a lot of MLS fantasy content out there. And one thing that I've always noticed, I mean, because I've been a big sports fan my whole life, is that I think when it comes to fans and being a fan of a league and there's a value to just having a way of interacting with it. I think that's one of the reasons like NFL, NBA, MLB, a lot of these sports have such a strong following, is that there's such an interactive approach. And I think MLS fantasy or just fantasy sports in general is one of those key cornerstones to like really taking it to the next level. And so for me, that was one of the other ambitions, was just getting involved in that content and just finding a way to push that needle forward.
Yeah, we've had many conversations both on the live stream and off in the Discord about that exact subject, that the belief that fantasy, and I'd include betting in that as well, creates another just an interaction point that you can have with the players and with the team as a fan. Mm-hmm. And that does nothing but help create more buzz, more interest, more ownership of the sport or the league. And so we definitely agree with you as far as that goes. So as far as actual fantasy, you guys are players, right? Obviously we can tell from your content. Let's talk about some general approaches that you guys, again, for people that haven't seen your content, what are some general approaches that you guys take when you're building out your lineups each week?
Nice. I love this question. For me, I think there's probably 2 or 3 main starting points. One, I generally look for big betting favorites. So, and that's one of the main matchups that me and Blake look at, is like who are the best, like who are just the biggest betting favorites on the week. Generally, that means that team is going to have more control of the game. They're going to have more possession. They're going to have more opportunities in the attacking third. And so all those for me are the key factors to hone in on for a double stack or more. We generally look at clean sheets. I like to look at clean sheet percentage, whether it's on dimers.com is one of our sources that we like to use a lot, or just really any betting odds in terms of just what does Vegas think is the most likely team to hold their opponent to 0 goals, and keying in on them for defenders and goalkeepers. And then home team. I think home teams just generally looking. I mean, I want to probably play. I mean, minimum 10 of my 15 in a home game, but probably more than that. I maybe will pick a couple flyers on the road, but I'm very. I mean, it's just a safer floor generally in MLS because of the travel. When you add CCC into it as well, but I would say those are kind of the 2 or 3 big factors for me is home team, big betting favorites and clean sheets, and then that kind of gives me the core foundation of my roster, and then I kind of, break it down into more steps from there.
Yeah, and I believe it is actually pretty well known that MLS is the home field advantage in MLS is higher than most other leagues across the world. So that's probably a wise factor in there. What about you, Blake? What as far as building lineups, do you have any additional tips or things that you do?
Not really. I think one thing that I've coined this year, and a lot of people utilize the strategy, especially early on in the season when budgets, are pretty low. You start out with 100 mil, so you got to find those budget friendly players. So the Dollar Tree defense is something that I coined this year, and so far this season it's really been interesting to see how some of these 4 mil defenders are scoring. Alex Freeman was a couple weeks ago, and luckily I was ahead of the curve on that one. That was one of my best MLS fantasy takes of all time. I will take that one to the grave with me, Brian.
Yep.
Tate Johnson this past week for Vancouver. It seems like there's somebody that's about a 4 mil player that's stepping up on a weekly basis. So identifying those plus matchups and maybe not always going for the Kai Wagners, maybe going for the Westfields. That was something I did this past weekend as well. So maybe not spending super premium on the defense and finding a valuable option in the back line as well that's a bit cheaper. That's definitely one of them. And then, like Brian said, we utilize a lot of the data by dimers. They don't give us, but we look up the odds, who has the best percentages to win. We take those into consideration. We match those up against, okay, well, this is what dimers is saying. This is what the info that we're finding on FBref. This is what the shot creating actions look like. So we're just kind of comparing and contrasting data, making sure those things add up and using our best judgment from there. But ultimately, like, we can nerd out about this all day. And I've said it a couple times this year, like, yes, do your research. Yes, try to make the most informed decisions. But at the end of the day, like, this is a game. It's a fantasy game. Have some fun with it. If you have a vibe pick that, you just really like a guy, or you really like watching a guy, or you think that, this is a week where away players are going to have a good run, like, just go with your gut, man. And oftentimes, like, I know you're going to talk about some advice, like, sometimes your first draft is your best draft. I made my first draft today on the toilet in about 3 minutes, and it's probably the hitter. It's going to be the draft that goes off for 75 to 100 points. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tinker myself to death down to about 50 points for this round. So, yeah, first draft is usually the best draft. And those are just some of my super basic strategies, I suppose. I don't really have much strategy, man. I kind of follow Brian.
Brian, how about you? That was a great one for new people, Blake. What about you, Brian? Anything for new people?
Yeah, I feel like the main thing is to not overthink it if you're new. I think that's one of my biggest flaws now, even after having played for a while, is like I spend sometimes too much time, like I said, tinkering, overthinking, going back and forth. And I think reminding myself that it is a game that I just enjoy and want to have some fun with. I think as a new player, being willing to be okay with just testing it out, trying things, learning. I think that's one of the reasons why we've enjoyed our show, specifically doing dropping points and just opening the show with like what some of our misses were and what we learned from those misses. I think that's a big part of it. It's just like taking your results. Like this week was a good example. Took a lot of hits on the chin, and so but like taking those hits and just being like, you know what did I mess up? How do I learn from that? And like what was like the key factors going into like me making some of those mistakes, and then like trying to learn from them going into the next week. And then it's kind of more of like a fun learning exercise. It's not like, I just suck at everything and like I just can't make a right pick or this or that. And just kind of like, you know what? It happens. Like, or like this last week, I actually felt like I made a lot of good picks. And obviously we're going to get more into depth in that and as the show continues. But I think just knowing that and just knowing sometimes, you know what, there was a logic behind the selections I made and it just didn't happen, right? Hani Mukhtar misses a PK. Like, what are you gonna do? Like, you set him up and then he just doesn't knock it down. And so just taking it on the chin sometimes and knowing, like, you know what, sometimes I make a good pick and it just doesn't work out. You know, that just knowing that that is still a good pick is important. And then at the same time, in reverse, like when I do make a bad pick, whether I get lucky or unlucky with that pick, knowing like, hey, this is like I can evaluate that I didn't logically come to that a good conclusion and I made that choice anyway, whether it was emotional, like this last week, picking Wilfred Zaha as a Charlotte FC fan, things like that. And so, you know, whether I'm, just trying to learn from all those different decisions and then just, taking it on the chin and moving on to the next week. And every week's a new opportunity.
Yeah, and I think I'll add on to
Used to
that
lose
is
some
that
sleep.
yeah, it is still super early in
Yeah.
the season as well, and I think a lot of people get frustrated if they don't hit
Yeah.
and their rank doesn't start moving up super early, and everybody's so tight together that all it takes is you miss out on a couple of points and you drop 200 spots at this point still. So I think patience is a
Yeah.
big piece of that too.
For
Well,
sure.
guys, I appreciate that. I just want to acknowledge we did have some technical difficulty through that segment, so I apologize about that, both to you guys and anybody listening. Hopefully, everybody can hear now. Let us know if you can't, either in the Discord or in the chat. Let us know if we're having audio problems. We'll see if we can get that taken care of. But for now, we'll pause for just 1 second so we can move on to the round recap. All right. Thank you so much for that, Brian and Blake. Love hearing about the podcast and kind of your thought process. Let's jump into the previous round. So we just went through round 3, and just if you would kind of just give me an idea about like how did you do this round, like what kind of point totals, that kind of thing, and then was there anything that you noticed about this round that you want to share? Brian, how about you first?
Yeah, so I had a rough go this week. Finished on 57 points. My team's still at pretty decent value, 109.7. So still maintaining its pace on value, but I definitely took a huge, huge hit. The biggest thing is just, I mean, I think that's kind of going par for the course for most of the first 3 weeks is like my biggest disappointment is just figuring out how to pick midfielders. And we talked about this going into the season with the amount of changeover, whether it was like Lucho Acosta going to Dallas, Evander going to Cincinnati, Puig being injured for most of the season. We had Gomez who was transferred last summer. Just like a lot of the top midfielders that were just kind of like week in, week out, week in, week out options that you could just always count on aren't in the same setup or are completely not a part of the league right now. And so, and I feel like you can kind of tell like it's been really hard to hit on midfielders, at least for me. This past week again went pretty chalk and it didn't really matter. And just couldn't really find a hit. And that's kind of been par for the course right now. Forward line for me has been a little bit easier to predict. And then the defense, I mean, Blake, I think I saw you post like it was 12 clean sheets this past week, which has got to be close to a record. I mean, that's a ton of clean sheets. So it seemed like being defensive heavy would pay dividends right now. Whereas usually I feel like I'm almost always picking 3 at the back and trying to go stacking attacking options, whether it's heavy in the midfield or heavy in the forward line. And so really disappointed there with just like how hard it has been for me to pick midfielders right. The surprise for me is Chicago Fire, which dropped a goose egg on Peter Musa, and which was we were so we were probably talking about Dallas more than any team we've ever talked about on one episode ever, and we kind of called it out like it was gonna happen that this was gonna fall apart, and sure enough, I mean I think Acosta still got me like 6 or somewhere close to that, but Musa.
Ryan, he got you 3 because I
Oh
capped him and he only
boy.
got me 6. I know exactly what you got. I'm very familiar.
Yeah, all right. So the Dallas double stack got us a total of 3 points between Peter Musa's 0 and Lucho Acosta's 3. And we were, I mean, I was at the point where I was willing to triple stack their fourth attacker was how high I was on this matchup against Chicago Fire. So got to give the Fire a little bit of love here. I'd say they've been a surprise team for me. They've been starting to put up a decent amount of goals through the first 3 weeks, and this last week, the way they just kind of really put it on Dallas towards the end, I'm starting to get pretty impressed by them. Bamba hasn't found the finish, but he's been finding a lot of great opportunities. And Brian Gutierrez is, I mean, obviously he had the suspension and he still seems pretty chippy and gets a little frustrated as a young player, but seems like he's going to have a lot of opportunities to just create. And it seems like Greg Berhalter's system in the long term is going to really benefit a young player like Gutierrez, just his opportunity to create a lot and create chances. And I'm a lot higher on the Fire right now than I was going into the season. And I'm honestly like I'm monitoring a couple of their players for this week.
Well, Gutierrez does look like the kind of player who's going to take a step forward this season, doesn't he? As far as at least from the early game, which I mean that's great to see another midfielder step up because, like, I think one of my takeaways was also Brian that this week was just we call it in our Discord. Well,
Yeah.
why'd that happen? Because MLS, right? The chalk pick that should have hit that as far as like Dallas versus Chicago. Chicago's defense has been trash for how many seasons now?
Yeah.
I don't even mean it's been bad. It has been straight trash for seasons now. And you expect that home match, especially with the form that Musa was on, to be to hit. And it's just the nature of everything. We had red cards this weekend. We had missed penalties this weekend, and I do think you hit on something as far as the midfielders. I believe that like MLS lost so many consistent performers.
Yeah.
Between that and then the CONCACAF Champions Cup rotation, Evander hasn't hardly started at all in the league. So you have talent like that. Gall just got hurt. I mean, Gall got hurt in what was it? Early minutes, you know? And like when does that stuff happen? Right? Like it just doesn't. So this was one of those weeks that I think everybody's just glad we moved on to the next one. Blake, what about you? What do you see?
157 points. I don't know about you guys, but kidding. I'm looking at the dream team. I finished on 49. It was an abysmal week for me. Absolutely terrible week. Yeah, thanks for laughing, guys. Appreciate that. I thought it was a good joke. But back to the Chicago Fire. I called them the dumpster fire on dropping points last week. And I mean, Wojo, you gave them a little bit more credit than I think they deserve. Yes, they might be better defensively than they have been in the past, but like, let's not sugarcoat it. Like, they gave up a PK, the PK was missed, and then they conceded a goal that VAR took a look at it, and it was offside. So like that game could have ended 3-3. And like, if you guys take a look at some of the underlying numbers, like Chicago is extremely volatile. Like there are going to be goals on both sides of every single game that Chicago plays in. Their XG per 90 is up there. Their expected goals against per 90 is up near the worst in the league as well. So there are going to be goals on both sides, which like I know we'll talk about some of our player picks later, but like Toronto versus Chicago this week is going to be hopefully a shootout, but probably a 0-0 game because we're talking about it like there should be goals galore. And that's just kind of how this game works, right? It's the kind of the reverse jinx. But no, like I said, guys, I finished on 49. I mean, it was a terrible week. I know Brian talked about midfield and midfield being so difficult to pick. Like, I should have talked about it when I talked about my general approach to the game. The usual formation I ran with probably from the halfway point of last year through the end of last year was the 5-3-2 when I had two scrubs on my bench. So the top two of my three players on the bench would just auto sub in. And that would be two midfielders and a forward. So whoever were the best two of those guys would sub in. So like this year, what I'm finding is right before I came on the show, like I looked at my average points for my defense through the first 3 weeks. I didn't do it for all three positions, but my defenders, I haven't had a defender score less than 7 in the first 3 weeks. And that's not because I'm great at picking defenders. That's because there's just been clean sheets galore. Like everybody's having clean sheets. In round 2, there was 9. This past round, there were 12. Like this is kind of, I don't know that it's unprecedented, but like Brian said, like 12 is a really, really, really large number. And I'm probably going to go, if I get some time, go back just through last year and see on average how many teams kept a clean sheet and what that looks like this year and how that compares. But so my tactic kind of going forward is like pick three defenders, and then because the midfield is still kind of so up for grabs and we really don't know who is the guy or who are going to be the chalk picks, take some of the risk out of it and put two of those guys on the bench, and leave myself a little bit more flexibility in my lineup. So that's something I'm kind of learning. I should have figured that out already because I figured it out last year, but I'm switching up how I'm approaching the game, I guess, a little bit. But yeah, that's how I did. Are we getting into surprises now?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and talk about those.
Surprise was Chicago, and rightfully so. They're super fun. They're an MLS Gone Wild team this year. My surprise so far has been Nashville SC. They got a pretty good result over the weekend against Portland. Portland sucked. Let's just call it what it is. And so Nashville capitalized on that. But what's been most impressive to me is how Nashville is playing under BJ Callahan. On last week's show, my long shot pick was Andy Nahar. I wish I would have put Andy Nahar on my team because he scored a goal. Andy Nahar's been one of the best wingbacks in the league so far this season. He's kind of flying under the radar. Don't think he really is for MLS fantasy anymore. But they've transitioned from quite literally a transition-oriented, off the ball, not on the ball team to a possession-first team. Last year they held 47% possession. This year they're up to 54, so 7% jump through 3 games this season as far as how often they have the ball. And not are they just playing with the ball more, they are creating chances with it. So last year, just in general, they created 19.41 shot creating actions per 90, and they've turned that into 28.33 through the first 3 matches of 2025. And that's good for second best in Major League Soccer right now. So year over year kind of success and kind of what they've been able to accomplish and how quickly they've been able to establish and implement their game model under BJ Callahan has been really, really impressive. And I think it was maybe pre-show, Matt, we talked about Hani Mukhtar a little bit. Hani Mukhtar may not have the same ceiling that he had in past years, but he looks like he's got a pretty safe floor. He missed a penalty kick, but he still got 6 points. That's the kind of player that I'm going to be taking a look at on an every given week basis, especially when he's playing at home. But he looks like he has kind of reestablished himself as a decently high floor player. And we haven't figured a lot of that out so far this season. So to be able to find Hani doing that and seeing some of the success that Nashville's having is promising going forward. My disappointments are kind of the same as Brian's. It's just FC Dallas, man. We spent 30 minutes on last week's show waxing poetic about Peter Musa. Peter Musa was my tap-in. Brian's tap-in was Lucho Acosta. We were like, this is finally the week that Lucho, has his breakout week for FC Dallas. And it could have been, but like I said, goal called back VAR, missed penalty kick, just didn't capitalize on their chances. And so that was super disappointing. And then my general fantasy takeaway was the clean sheet thing and just how I'm going to approach the game going forward. And, just playing 3 defenders that I trust in because they're hitting more times than not. And then playing a bit safe and leaving a little bit of flexibility in my midfield with having, an auto ruse set up. And if I need to flex, I can. So just my general approach to the game is going to kind of change going forward just based on the amount of clean sheets that are happening.
Do you guys have any theories on why there's so many clean sheets this early in the season? Do you think it's just a fluke, or do you think it has something to do with one of the factors that we talked about?
No, I think it's a complete fluke. I think my theory is that there's the amount of new signings that have come in from last summer into this winter. I mean, it's like a record amount of transfers, right? So, I mean, a lot of this is the Messi effect. And so if you look at and most of them are, at least the big money spent is on the attacking side. So the disparity between the valuation of attacking players versus defensive players is maybe the widest it's ever been. I mean, I don't have any specific numbers to back it up, but just based on the eye test of the amount of money being spent on the attacking line right now, league wide is pretty substantial and hitting new territory. My theory is that it's just this many new faces and this many clubs having to figure out how to play together is taking time. I mean, we're seeing it from so many people who were hype on Charlotte FC, including, me. We had Tom Bogert come into town for their home opener. He was on our show and he was super hype on them, right? So it's just the amount of national pundits that are hype on whether it's Charlotte FC and their new signing Wilfred Zaha, Atlanta, Cincinnati, I mean, just across the league, a lot of these big new signings, but they're not really hitting the ground running. I mean, they had good debuts, but overall as a team, a lot of these teams aren't really staying consistent. I think there's a lot of changeover. Also, like Houston had a ton, like they had a changeover in the opposite way, right? A lot of their players are gone and they haven't completely finished reloading. Columbus Crew is another example where they've completely got to bring them up.
I
Blake, I'm
thought we were
sorry, I'm
dodging the
sorry.
bullet here, man.
No, no, no. I got to touch on both sides of that matchup, man. Houston and
Yeah,
Columbus. That was a snooze fest.
it was hard. That was hard.
What about Wojo's Atlanta, man? Shut out in two straight with Latte Latin Almiron in the team.
That's
Huh?
but that's 100% what it is though, because all the journos here are talking about how Almiron and Saba both cut in. They're both inverted wingers, and they're cutting into the same space as Moranchuk and like basically squeezing him out. And I have opinions on him just as a player in general because he's had half a season with us already,
Yeah.
and so I have my opinions on his quality already. But ultimately, it doesn't help to have your three most creative attacking players all trying to occupy like this smaller space, and basically, and your fullbacks are out, so you don't have the width going down the side. And so, I mean, how hard is it to stop that attack at that point? And so, I think that's one of the things that De La has to figure out is like how to avoid that from happening moving forward. So my I did
Right?
54. Go ahead. I had 54 points. I'm about 108.3 million. So I'm doing pretty well with the value rise. I'm sitting about 500 overall. I don't start looking at that for another few weeks, like seriously. I try to keep that arrow going in the right direction, but I don't start looking at overall ranking for a while. Some of my surprises are, man, Olaf Melberg has St. Louis defense turned around already. Like, look at that, three games in. Only team that's not been scored on in those games after being like a bottom five defense, arguably a bottom five defense last year. Is Kai Wagner reclaiming his throne atop the defenders list? He had a rough season last year too, and first three games I think he's got goal contributions. I think he has assists in the first three games, and so they're obviously playing out of their minds, which is helpful. But we've it when the scoring changes happened last year, it really kind of it deflated our defense a little bit, our defensive options, and so him having an off season last year didn't help things. So the fact that he's contributing to the attack is really good. As far as disappointment, I mean the Galaxy 0-4 in all competitions right now. It's a long drop from first to worst. And so it's hard. It's kind of hard to see a silver lining, at least until Pencil gets back. Until I don't know if Ramirez is going to start clicking, like you were talking about, Brian. Like, is that one of those new guys that you add to an attack, and it does? Is it working? Does it end up working? And so I think Peck, to me, is still fantasy viable, because I think he had 7 this weekend without even scoring. So, but other than that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you can't take the defense. You couldn't take the defense last season. So that makes it difficult. And then, I mean, I thought some of the changes in New England, I thought they were going to turn it around, and they clearly have not yet. Having trouble scoring, having trouble keeping people from scoring. Some things never change, I guess. You have hope in the off season, and Carlos Heel has not looked strong. Again, that's another one of those midfielders that normally we'd be able to toss in there every week and at least have a floor, and it's been rough for that. So those are kind of my thoughts. Also wanted to share that the Fantasy Boss team put together a sub $100 million team just to see, for new people coming in, maybe they didn't get started on the first week, and just to see if we could still put together a solid team with just 100 million, even if you hadn't had any price rises. And that team actually beat Reid's team this past weekend. So just so you know, any new people who are trying to get into the game, you can still outscore some of the other teams. With the insanity that's going on, I'm not super surprised, but I thought that was interesting to share.
Nice.
All right, guys. Well, any other thoughts from this past weekend?
I think we got to mention San Diego as well. I
Okay,
mean,
yeah.
just what an incredible start for an expansion team. I mean, I'd say they're pretty much, I don't know if they've got a record solid, like the record for the first 3 games in terms of points, but I mean, can't ask for much more than what they've put forward so far. They're scoring goals. Anders Dryers looks like a super serious threat going forward. I mean, some of their defenders are for MLS fantasy purposes, are some of the highest scoring defenders so far through the first few weeks, and so props to them to getting a roster on the field. And if you look at their schedule going into this season, probably didn't look like a super easy schedule. Obviously, nobody expected LA Galaxy to completely fall off the way they have, but still to be able to go into LA in a place where they hadn't lost in like over a year, and getting another result this past weekend as well. I mean, it's really, really solid start to a franchise. So you can't ask for much more than that. I think they definitely deserve some props.
On last week's show, St. Louis was the first expansion team since the 2009 Sounders to have shutouts in their first 2 games in franchise history. They gave up a goal to RSL. They gave up a ton of XG, but their goalkeeper Dos Santos is pretty good, and that the defense looks pretty sound as well. And I love that they're doing it their way. It's something we talked about on the show as well. Like, not very often do you see a team come into Major League Soccer with 11 new players plus the bench players and possess the ball as much as they're able to do it. And no, they're not going out there and outscoring teams 3-4-0, but they're doing it in a very organized fashion that makes them hard to break down. So they have been super, super impressive. And then just looking back at the scoreboard from last round, the Seattle Sounders, man, like 5-2 against LAFC. Yes, I know both are coming off CCC, a lot of rotation. The one thing that really stood out, and it was one of Brian's main points last week, was Albert Rusnak did not start that match. Pedro de la Vega got injured, and then Albert Rusnak ended up being the player of the week after playing, less than an hour of soccer against LAFC. So he looked great, and then just overall their depth, man. They just signed the right back from I think Tacoma Defiance or whatever their MLS Next Pro team is, and He came out, he scored a goal. Paul Rothrock had himself a hell of a game. He's a cheap midfielder. If he starts to get more minutes, he had a pretty efficient season last year. He's not going to be super high on my radar, but he could get some spots, starts or looks in your team. And Georgie Manungo, a number of those guys that were rotation pieces were just really, really, really good. And if you need a cheap player, like if you are a guy that has, if you are an MLS fantasy player that's working on a low budget right now, they have some options there. Sporting Kansas City, they've lost 10 straight games going back to last season. Like, we're starting to figure out, not that we haven't already known, but there's teams that we're going to start targeting. Sporting Kansas City being a team we're going to target. Toronto, Portland, like, we're starting to figure this thing out. And I think figuring out and identifying those teams that we're going to target going forward is going to be big throughout the next couple of weeks. And once you start to turn your season around, like Matt said, we're probably both in the 500 overall rank range. So identifying those teams to target against will definitely help you gain some rank.
Speaking of targets, as we look ahead, let's go ahead, Blake. Do you have something else?
EFC is a team that has interested me. They just got their first win of the season. They opened up the season in a 2-2 draw against Miami, and then they had to go to LAFC in a game they lost 1-0. So when you think about strength of schedule, like, that was probably the team that arguably had the toughest strength of schedule. They lost Santiago. What's his name? What? Oh God, I'm blanking. Santi. We'll just call him Santi. Santi Rodriguez. Yeah, they lost Santi right before the season. We've seen other teams like the Columbus Crew. They lost their best player, and they just haven't looked the same. No, New York City FC don't look the same, but like, they have a brand new coach. They had the toughest start to the season, arguably, against Miami and LAFC, and they were able to come out and beat probably an Eastern Conference playoff team in Orlando. They're getting ready to have an easier stretch of games coming up. That'll be a team to definitely take a look at. We started pretty low on them because of their early results, but I think they're a team to keep an eye on for sure.
Awesome. Well, let's close the book on this past weekend. I think nobody else wants to talk about it. It's it was so chaotic and it was such a cluster that let's kind of close the book on that. We'll take a pause real quick, and then we'll move on to the next round. All right, so moving on to the round schedule preview. So the matches are starting this week on Saturday, March 15th at 2:30 p.m. with not one but two matchups. So we're getting an extra matchup, guys. It looks like it's going to be a more, I would call it a more diverse slate of games because we're going to have three early and three on Sunday. What do you guys think about that schedule? Is that an advantage or a disadvantage for this week?
That was one of the most intriguing things about Major League Soccer changing kind of its weekly scheduling format to having a couple early Saturday games. That just sets you up for your switcheroos and autoroos, and then identifying possible keeperoo as well, and then having those late fallback options as well. That's what allowed Brian to go after Wilfred Zaha as his captain, because he still had some players available, and having those late game options as well to try to save your week and either save or sink you, and it sunk Brian a little bit. But I know some people went hardtail last night, and that definitely saved them. But I love the schedule, and I definitely think it's advantageous, especially to the sickos like us that pay attention to every lineup that drops.
More to watch too.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think this week specifically, I mean, the two matchups in the 2:30 time slot, I think are both really prime for just having switcheroo picks. Because especially the Toronto Chicago matchup, I don't think if it's in the 7:30 or 8:30 time slot, maybe is as intriguing. But there's probably no way I don't have at least two players from that game in. We talked about that in the first segment, that game should have a bunch of goals in it and a lot of chaos, which chaos generally produces fantasy points. And so I'm all about that, especially in a switcheroo spot where I can kind of mitigate the risk of the chaos by just having it be on my bench. And then if it hits, I get an opportunity to put it in. And if not, I can just kind of move on to the more consistent part of my lineup, which will be later in the day.
Yeah, and then then Sunday we've got three games. We've got Philadelphia, Nashville, Portland Galaxy, and Atlanta, Miami. Of course, Miami with the primetime slot. We're gonna have to figure out will we Messi or won't we Messi, and we can jump into that when we get to the player picks, guys. I'm gonna run through. There's no double game week, no bye rounds, obviously. There is CONCACAF Champions Cup this week. Home teams Columbus and LA Galaxy. So Columbus is down 0-3, Galaxy is down 0-1 on aggregate. Away teams, LAFC is up 3-0 in their matchup, but they are away. And then away traveling out of the country, we have Seattle who are on 0-0. FC Cincinnati is tied 1-1. Vancouver's tied 1-1, and Miami is up 2-0. Then they'll be in Jamaica, I believe, this week. So keep in mind as you make your lineups that you really, guys, you've got to pay attention to these. And I'm not saying you guys, but guys in general, pay attention to these matchups because some of this traveling is going to affect the players. The rotation, like the player rotation. We don't know who's going to start, so keep an eye on those lineups this midweek. Keep an eye on the lineups on the weekend. We've got a great article talking about how CONCACAF Champions Cup affects player performance on MLSFantasyBoss.com. Small plug there for some of our articles that we've been writing on the strategy of building lineups. That's something to keep an eye out. Also, another thing to keep an eye out, price rises. Any of the big week one scores will be dropping off the three match averages. Again, that was another strategy article that came out this past week about price rises and some of the theory behind it, the algorithm, how that works. So if you want to know about that, go to MLSFantasyBoss.com and find that out. But So some of the week one scores will be dropping off. So players like Jamar Ricketts from San Jose, who's kind of been popular fallback option recently. DeAndre Yedlin had a really big first week score, or even Diego Rossi. If they could start seeing value drops if they don't score well this week, because the first game will drop off, and then it'll just be the last 2 weeks and this week as the 3 games. And as we know, that's one of the bigger factors in price rises. So keep an eye on that. Make sure that they will not be losing that high score. And then injuries, call-ups, other absences, head on over to the Discord, get the latest player availability updates. There's our fantasy tools section, and you can find our mega reference there, which we try to keep pretty up to date. Our community over there does a great job of keeping track of injuries, call-ups. If you're Miami, red cards, right? They seem to be getting quite a few of those recently. Had to throw that in there. So those are the types of things to look for. As far as player target, let's jump right into the player target. Blake, this season, with the lack of BPs in defense, what are you doing? Who are you looking at, especially for this week? What's up?
Starting off with probably the front end of my keeperoo. I'm not sure of his price right now. I could pull up my lineup. That doesn't matter. Carlos Cornell of the New York Red Bulls. They have back-to-back clean sheets against Atlanta. Forget who the other clean sheet was against. And then he's also kept clean sheets in the last 2 against Orlando. So they're currently in pretty good defensive form. They've been one of the best defenses in Major League Soccer over the last 3-4 years as well. And he has Orlando's number. So I kind of look to him at the front end. And then Matt Freese for New York City FC. So I'm sticking with the New York keepers here. That's just my early lean here, my early inclination. I'm probably going to be spending too much money on keepers because I was burnt last week, dude. Last week we didn't talk about it earlier, but I didn't go Schulte. I ended up going with what's goalkeeper's name for Seattle,
Thomas.
whoever they're. Yeah, Thomas. I ended up going Thomas because he was dirt cheap, and then he gave up a couple goals. So then I had Ustari, which probably most people had as their fallback because he's dirt cheap, and then he got the red card. Holy smokes, yeah, my goalkeeper situation was a mess last week, so I'm trying to correct that a little bit, and I might have to spend some money to do so. But I like Freese as well. New York City FC, as they will be hosting – who are they hosting? New England?
New England.
New England is the only team in Major League Soccer who has not yet scored a goal. So those seem like 2 pretty obvious targets to me. Andre Blake on Sunday as well looks like a fairly decent option. The Columbus Crew have been struggling to score. CJ Dos Santos is another option as well. And I think those are the main guys I'm taking a look at. I've seen the Pantomis show. That's probably some recency bias just because he saved 2 penalty kicks last week. I think the LA Galaxy are probably bound to score eventually, and that game is going to be extremely volatile. It's going to go over 2.5 goals. You can book it now, and I think LA Galaxy get at least 1 past Pantomis.
Y'all heard it here first, y'all.
Yeah.
All right. What about any defenders, Blake? You want to talk about, or do you just want to talk about the team?
I think Kai Wagner was one of my first picks in the team this week. I know I talked at the beginning of the show about maybe not going with the most expensive option and going for a guy like Westfield, which I did this week. And I went Westfield in round 3 because I also went Orellano. It's going to be really tough right now managing a team that has multiple defenders over like $7 million. So if you're going to pick a premium guy, you're probably only going to be able to have one of them. This week, I think I am going to go Kai Wagner against Nashville. They have a really good record against Nashville. Nashville doesn't score in Philly very often. I know I waxed poetic about Nashville earlier on in the show, but I really like Kai Wagner spot. If you don't have the funds for him, Westfield, they also have a dirt cheap center back as well. I really like Hack for New York City FC. I talked about, kind of targeting the New England Revolution. That's what I'm doing here. Hack plays out of position sometimes. Sometimes he partners up next to Keaton Parks in the New York City FC midfield. If not, regardless, he's a ball-playing center back in a plus matchup, so I like him, and he's dirt cheap. If you're looking for an outside back, sure. I think he got his first start for New York City FC this past weekend. I think he's 5.3. So they do have a couple options. Well, really any of their guys from New York City FC, just because we were targeting that New England team. And then Matt, confirm it, is Pedro Amador, he's back, correct?
Yes, he was back this week.
Playing against Miami, but I love what Pedro Amador did against Miami last year in that playoff series. 3 assists in 3 games, an
Mm-hmm.
assist in each one of those matches that eventually eliminated Miami from the MLS Cup playoffs. So I like the attacking upside there. I don't know if I'm all in on that, but that's kind of a super flyer pick there. Probably not going to get the clean sheet, as we know that Atlanta like to leak some goals, but there is attacking upside in Pedro Amador. San Diego defenders, like I had mentioned about CJ Dos Santos, for the same reason. The Columbus Crew are struggling. They've had under 1 XG over the last 2 matches after putting up a 4 spot on Chicago. So I hate to target against my Columbus Crew, but they don't look great right now. They look like they're really lacking ideas. And San Diego has looked like one of the better defenses in Major League Soccer thus far. And that's impressive to say about an expansion team. Ali Ahmed, I know that Vancouver are away, but a 6.5 mil out of position defender that's actually playing higher up the field, like right wing. And now with Ryan Gauld injured, he could play a bigger role. Keep in mind they have CCC this week as well, but that's just somebody to keep an eye on. And not a great matchup, but Dallas let us down this past week, so why won't they this week, right? And then Aaron Herrera for DC United. DC's going to give up goals, but again, this is kind of an attacking upside pick. He's going to be providing that really good service from the right side into Benteke. I kind of like Aaron Herrera in the spot. He was somebody I eyed last week. It was either him or Nahar. I picked Nahar in the show, didn't pick him in my team, but I kind of like Herrera there as a flyer as well.
Yeah, I definitely see a, a similarity between your picks, and they all tend to have like that attacking upside, which is probably a wise choice given a little more ceiling for those players, because if they hit a clean sheet and a goal contribution, then that's a good way to start rising up those ranks. Brian, what do you think, man, on defenders and keepers?
Yeah, I mean, pretty similar across the board. The reason I added Pantomis was just because you have the 14 points from this last week. So if you have to, like, if I mean, he's definitely not my starter, but if I miss on my keeperoo and I'm looking at Sunday and I just want to at least save some value, because I think it's still first 4 or 5 weeks, value is still a part of the equation for the next couple of weeks, just making sure that I continue to maintain. So I do think if you're looking for an option to just make sure you have like, hey, guaranteed zero point 0.5, 0.5 mil, Pantomis will do it. But I think Kalina is one other name to maybe just shout out from the early games. I think we've covered most of the other ones. I mean, obviously, Freese, I think, is near the top. Coronel is probably the top two. Maybe then Hugo Lloris would be power ranked third there for me. And then I think Kalina comes in right then after that. Not so much because the matchup, or I mean, FC Cincinnati obviously more than capable of putting up goals against Charlotte, but Charlotte FC are also pretty strong at home. They're a completely different team there, and they just last year they had a ton of clean sheets at the bank, and it doesn't really matter who their opponent is. So that's still an option there. I do think there's a couple other keepers that are higher up on my just big board of keepers this week, and then speaking of Blake and just the Philadelphia Union overall, just their defense, I think what I like about them being on the Sunday, it gives me a ton of flexibility as to how I want to maybe switcheroo defenders early. Right now, I've got Valencia in the 2:30 game from New York, and then again for New York against Orlando, and then also I can switcheroo like a more premium option like a McNair from San Diego, because it's in the even if it's in the later fixture, I can really kind of have just a lot of flexibility with my switcheroos defensively because I can just bank on Philadelphia coming in on Sunday. So I think out of the defensive, just the entire setup, Philadelphia being that Sunday game just gives me a ton of flexibility to mess around with switcheroos on the defensive side of things early. And that's the direction I'm kind of leaning right now. We'll kind of see how things play out, but I just definitely like Wagner's going to be in my lineup, and so is I mean Westfield I think is an option as well. And I think it's just a matter of like how do I want to play with the rest of it, but just having multiple Philly players available that late in a game week, I think just gives me a ton of flexibility to mess around with my defense early on the switcheroo side of things. Usually I like to switcheroo midfielders and try to go for a really big ceiling, but it just seems like with that matchup specifically, it kind of is dictating play to go, for me at least, to take some swings in switcheroos defensively this week.
Yeah, you guys have covered pretty much most anybody that I would talk about. I mean, I'm kind of torn on saying this because I don't want to be put on the record, but Lloris was one of the first ones I kind of put in my draft this morning, or this whenever the lineups came out today.
Yep.
And I mean, obviously, it's going to depend on what happens this week and what the lineups look like this weekend. But they've been so good on defense.
Yeah.
Well, up until this past week, away to Seattle. But before that, and in the cup, they've actually been really really solid. And I mean, I'll get some crap from some of the Austin fans, but Austin hasn't really been clicking entirely yet. I know Uzuni is back, and he looked promising from what I understand. So that's something to think about. But he was the first one I put in. I like the Freeze pick. I like the Coronel pick. I think even Blake, provides that good keeperoo option for a second day. I don't know about Philly's defense. I'm still kind of on the fence. I don't know how to read Nashville and Philly yet as far as defenses. Nashville's defense has been really, or let me rephrase that: Nashville's attack versus Philly's defense. I don't know how to read those quite yet. And then as far as defenders, I mean, outside of Wagner, I still think you're going cheap. There's a bunch of cheap options, and that's one of the actually one of the cool things about the year so far is that we've had so many like 4.5 defenders who have, I mean, we talked about all the clean sheets. Like, you just get the cheapest way into the defense that you like. And that's a strategy of mine anyway, is to just find the cheapest way into that defense and use other money, pour it into your forwards, pour it into your you may even have a chance to do a keeperoo with two legit goalies, right, Blake? At that point, if you go cheap on defense, and then that allows you to kind of play that game as far as the keepers. But Valencia, Edwards from Atlanta. I mean, Miami, he's probably not going to keep a clean sheet at Miami, but stranger things have happened. And at 4.5, I mean, he's a fallback anyway as far as their timing. So unless Lennon comes back for some reason quicker than we expected. But yeah, NYCFC, LAFC, you guys mentioned most of the other ones. So I think we pretty much covered those. Brian, what about midfield? What do you think, man?
Yeah, I think honestly, midfield this week is really, really wild. I tried to just mention some names so that give y'all each some space here. So I just kind of threw out some names that I hadn't really talked about at all this year or most other seasons previously. I mean, Andres Dryers, we talked about it earlier on the show, but I mean, I think he's a really interesting candidate this week against Columbus at home. I think even like Lukic is a cheaper value option. Like what I saw from him in Philadelphia, and that's a late fallback pick. He's at like 6 or 7 mil, somewhere in that range. I think Pep Bial in Charlotte FC is also an option from one of the earlier games, a value option, just because I mean it's a home matchup, and he seems to be the most dangerous threat and what's been kind of a pretty mediocre attack, but at home different story again. And then two other candidates that I'm really intrigued in, or well, let's go with just three because it's all from the early matchup. Bamba and Gutierrez from Chicago, and then Bernadeschi from Toronto. We talked about that matchup a little bit earlier, just how chaotic it could be, how many goals there could be. I love the over on that one. It's honestly kind of lower than I thought. Dimers had it at like 55%, and I'm smashing the over on that one. Just from both sides of the ball there. I think there's an opportunity for a lot of goals. And so I'm intrigued by all three of those guys. I know I didn't cover most of the main guys. I know you guys have picks for some of the other heavy hitters, but I kind of want to just hit some of the maybe lower key options that I'm keying in on, and those are all candidates that I'm looking at, specifically Gutierrez and Bernadeschi for that switcheroo early.
Blake, what do you think?
As well, those are guys that I'm going to really have to consider. I really like Bernadeschi there. You want to maybe also consider Bamba there as well. He's amongst like the top 5 or 6 players in key passes so far this season. So he's a guy to keep an eye on. one guy that's a super flyer pick, Brian, I might use him as the long shot on tomorrow's show. So a lot of people are looking at DaCosta, the new DP, the Evander replacement for Portland. But Santi Moreno just made his return this past week. He came in the 46th minute against Nashville. I'm not exactly sure how he performed in that match, but he has a great history against the LA Galaxy as well. I've got just smashed myself in the face with my mic. He scored or assisted in, I believe, 3 straight games against the LA Galaxy. So he's a guy that, if he is fully healthy, if he does get the start in a game that's highly favored to go over 2.5 goals, a guy with that history against that team, that could be a guy to take a pretty good look at. A couple other players that I like in another game that's highly favorable to go over 2.5 is both Christian Espinoza on one side and then possibly Georgi Mihailovic. Again, there's some more chalky picks, but I think Brian and I are kind of keying in on some of the guys that folks maybe aren't quite thinking about. But both of those teams are pretty bad defensively. I know San Jose has gotten off to a more promising start than a lot of us thought they would under Bruce Arena. Although I thought that, a lot of us thought they'd be better. I don't think we thought they would start off kind of as well as they really have, even though they just lost to Minnesota. But both of these teams are conceding a ton of chances, second and third most shot creating actions against per 90, both of those teams. So like Dimers is giving that one a 61% a chance going over, and there's shot creating actions on both sides of the ball. So there will be goals in that game. So those are just some of my flyer picks. Let me get back over here to the document. Forsberg in the early match as well against Orlando. I like that one. He hasn't been great to start the season, but I like this matchup, and I like using him as an auto roo there to just kind of preview auto roo or a switcher to kind of preview his points. I know it's somebody that we haven't really mentioned. I haven't seen him really anywhere in the notes is Albert Rusnak. I know that they're traveling for CCC, but with Pedro de la Vega out, we saw what he could do. We do have to keep in mind that they did rotate heavily this past weekend against LAFC, and they do have those viable bench options. They're one of the more deep teams in Major League Soccer, but if Albert Rusnak is in that starting 11, he's absolutely somebody that you cannot ignore. We talked about Hani Mukhtar's floor. Rusnak has a higher floor than Hani Mukhtar. So if he's in that 11, obviously monitor those lineups and put him in. I like Gazdag this week. Again, we're talking about that Philly-Nashville matchup, and we don't really know how that's going to go. Philly's game model right now is a buzzsaw. They're higher pressing than they even were under Jim Curtin. I love what they're doing. They're winning the ball back high up the field. They're going forward with conviction. I like Daniel Gazdag this week, and I'm even considering possibly captaining him. Dreyer, and then another guy that we haven't really talked a whole lot about on the show. Well, Matt, you talked about him earlier, was Saba Labjanidze for Atlanta. He was a Miami killer last year in those playoffs. I love finding a player that has in form against the team that they're getting ready to play against. And Saba had a bunch of goal contributions last year against Miami. So why not him again, But that's a super flyer there as well.
Yeah, he was all they had last year. So, but yeah, you're right. Miami's defense is definitely can be gotten. So I've thought because I watch a lot of Atlanta United, and Saba's been pretty much their furthest forward midfielder. And so I've been saying since the beginning of the season that he'd be the one that would benefit from the upgraded playmaking in that Atlanta midfield, whether it's Cleach or Almiron or Moranchuk. Saba would be one of the recipients of that. And so, yeah, again, we've yet to see it just because of the chemistry and cohesiveness, but once it starts clicking, I think that's going to be the case. So yeah, it could be. I mean, and as a fallback, it'd be one of those kind of like Hartle this past week, where if you need a fallback late, he could be a good option for that. And I'll just throw out a couple others that didn't get mentioned. I mean, Lucho Acosta. I know you guys are off Dallas now after last week. You're burned, but Vancouver does have a little bit of a trip.
Yep.
And while Lucho, I mean, his numbers haven't been super convincing, and I'm not sure how fit he is at this point, but it's still I still think it's a decent matchup, especially with depending on the rotation for Vancouver. And then the McGlynn Bassi kind of mix in Houston there. Both of those guys are capable, and RSL on the road is not the same as RSL at home. So it could and Bassey's cheap. I mean, I think he's less than 7.5 right now. So, um, Segovia is another one for Miami, who could be a fallback option there, another cheap one. He didn't do much this past week, but he has been getting involved. And I mean, anybody on Miami, if you take a flyer on him at the end, is gonna um, could blow up. I mean, so we'll see. How about forwards, Blake?
Guy on my list, actually, again, just targeting a super plus matchup was Alonso Martinez for New York City FC. New England have conceded goals in back-to-back games against forwards, Jason Russell-Rowe and then Ty Baribo. I'm not sure if they actually gave him that goal this past weekend, but forwards are getting some chances and scoring some goals against them. New York City FC are at home. They've been a buzzsaw at home over the last 5 or 6 years. I like Alonso Martinez. He was one of the most efficient scorers in Major League Soccer last year. Why not take a flyer on him here? He's not priced right there with the rest of the premium guys. At least I don't think he is. I'm trying to pull up my team really quick.
It's a little bit lower. Do you load up on NYCFC defense, or do you just do a couple defenders and try to fit Alonso in there?
Stack Freese with maybe Hack. That's kind of my Freese with Hack plus Alonso Martinez is probably my New York City FC triple stack that I'm going with. Although
Mm-hmm.
I have considered going all in on the New York City FC defense, because if you can lock up all three, a goalkeeper shutout and then 2 clean sheets, like you're set. You're not set, but like your defense and goalkeeper situation are pretty much
Mm-hmm.
sorted out. But
Yeah.
I think I will have a piece of their attack there, and I think it probably will be Alonso Martinez. I like that pick there. Christian Benteke has scored in 3 straight weeks. They have a super plus matchup as well. I talked earlier about that Colorado versus San Jose game, so that can point you towards Arango. But I'm more so looking at Navarro. He's got 4 goal contributions in the last 2 versus San Jose. Again, he has San Jose's number. They're not the defensive team that, they're not an elite defensive team by any matter. They gave up the most goals in Major League Soccer history last year. They're not so far removed from that quite yet. Okay. So I like Navarro. He got on the score sheet last weekend as well. Bawanga, obviously, and I think something that's interesting about CCC this week is the Columbus Crew are down 3-0 at home to LAFC. I know LAFC rotated on the weekend against Seattle, but like they don't need to start their big dogs against the Crew. I don't think there's a way in hell the Columbus Crew are coming back to advance the CCC here. So keep an eye on if Wonga starts at that 3:45 time slot against Austin. He scored a couple hat tricks against Austin in the past. That could be definitely a player to consider. He's got one of the highest ceilings in all of Major League Soccer, and he's at home and what could be a plus matchup for them. I would take a look at him. Kuipers is a guy. Yeboah for Minnesota, probably another differential player because he's away. But Sporting Kansas City, they leak goals to opposition's forwards. And then Brian, another guy. I'm just giving away all my long shot picks tonight, Brian. So take a pick of any of these guys you want. Okay, is Jeremy Abobasi? Tapping into LAFC well again. Jeremy Abobasi has 8 goal contributions in 8 matches versus Austin. If you're looking for a guy that's got history against in a plus matchup, Jeremy Abobasi could be your guy.
Brian, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I'm thinking. I mean, I'm gonna double down on Benteke. I think he's got to stay in your lineup pretty much most weeks right now. He's in really good form, and again in a plus matchup against Montreal. And actually, I mean, he's a super long shot pick, and I don't think you're looking for value at forward. But if he gets the start, he's kind of been a hit or miss in terms of being in the starting lineup. But the other forward in DC, young Jacob Murrell, has an assist in his start, and then had a goal off the bench. Might not, there's a pretty decent chance he won't start, but if he does, I mean, that's an interesting differential and value pick there if you're looking to save some money on the forward line. Just targeting Montreal because they're now in their 4th straight road game. I would also say, I mean, Chicho's an interesting pick on the road against Houston, who have been really struggling. Like you said earlier, Matt, RSL aren't the same team on the road as they are at home. But Houston have just been in a really weird state. It's a tricky team to predict right now where they're at. Ty Baribo, I think I just have to mention him as an option pretty much every week until he stops scoring goals. I mean, he's tied the record for the most goals scored through the first 3 weeks. And actually, I threw out Latte Loth. I think Atlanta has an opportunity to do what Charlotte failed to do this last week against Miami, which was utilize their speed to actually attack Miami outright. Miami is one of the slowest teams in all of MLS, and Charlotte is a extremely fast team, their forward line, and Atlanta is even faster, I would say. And so they should have an opportunity to really put some pressure on Miami's back line just because of how slow Miami play. And so Latte Loth is an interesting fallback option.
Keep
Just
keep in mind on him real quick. He did go into concussion protocol after the game,
good call.
so that's a 5-day wait. They said he would likely be available, but
Okay.
definitely that's a wait and see.
Well, I mean that even makes me. I mean, that's still intriguing because if he can't go, Chiare is still a pretty quick backup option, and he's got pace as well. So
Hmm.
I'm interested in Atlanta's forward line. I don't trust Miami's clean sheet against Charlotte. I think Charlotte played horribly, a man up in that game and didn't utilize their speed against Miami's slow method of playing. And then Hugo Kuipers, I think, also deserves to get some shine as an option. Again, that's another switcheroo option. He's a little bit more expensive, but he's averaging like 9 points in fantasy right now, and he's scoring a bunch of goals for Chicago. And again, there should be goals in this one against Toronto. I'm not usually keen on playing an away forward, but against Toronto, it's just such a favorable matchup. And it being the 2:30 slot, if I'm looking at maybe getting, I mean, if I'm away from Brian Gutierrez and I'd rather pick a forward in that switcheroo and take a shot on him. I think those are just all a little bit differential picks there.
Yeah, those are some great picks, guys. Baribo, Benteke, Martinez are all on my list as far as is looking at those guys. I mean, you can't really look past the form of those guys. I also had Bawanga on the list, Blake. I mean, at some point the class is going to come through. Now, whether or not the rotation and the game pile up is affecting him, or just the lack of a midfield. I mean, their midfield got a complete turnover, and so but eventually he's going to hit, and you want to have him that week. I still think Moose is a decent pick. We talked about Dallas, but again, home, he scored in the first two, scored really well actually in the first two, 11 points each. And then a couple of guys that might get overlooked. I do think Peck has a decent, even though it's away, I still think he has a decent matchup. He's been scoring even without goals, 7 points without a goal this past weekend.
Yeah.
Which is great. And then Cedric Toyshirt is another one from St. Louis who usually scores pretty well without a goal contribution. So, you get a goal contribution on top of that, you're all of a sudden in like the 12, 13, 14 point range, which with one goal, which is incredible. A lot of key passes out of him. Again, depends on what kind of lineup Seattle puts out, but they gave up two this past week. They scored five, but they put up two. I don't care how many they give up if it's my forward. So, and he's under 750, which is another really, really good aspect if you want either a fallback guy or just a bench guy even. He'd be a little bit cheaper than some of the other ones. All right, as far as captains, guys, this is so one of the big differentials that I've always found, especially the past year or so, season or so, is you got to nail your captain.
Yeah.
Who are we picking this week to nail to try to move up in the rankings? Brian, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've got like probably six candidates if Messi can't go. I mean, it's pretty wide open right now. I really is. I mean, I just feel like midfield forward line, it's been a difficult situation to predict. And so I think there's not really like a sure locked in option. There's a couple in Philadelphia, right? Gazdag and Baribo, I think are both options just because of Baribo's consistent scoring right now, and Gazdag just being a key piece in the middle. Benteke, I think, is another flyer option just because of his matchup. Lucho Acosta, the talent eventually, you talked about Bouanga's talent, eventually just has to seep through and the points will be there. And I think Acosta is another candidate for that as soon as Dallas start clicking his consistency and his floor should rise, and then he becomes a more consistent captain. And this matchup, I think, also plays well for that. And then Anders Dryers, I mean, I think is another option just because of how consistent he's been early for San Diego. I think it's risky to take a captain on a brand new expansion team, but San Diego's form has been really, really solid. And then I threw out Forsberg as well, not the strongest form. And an early game. I'm never really super key on like picking a captain in that early window because I love switcherooing them. But I mean, Forsberg is the main guy in New York, and Orlando have had a really big problem with allowing a bunch of goals here early. They gave up what, 4 at home to Philly in week 1, and just dropped a few this last week as well to New York. So I mean, I feel like that's another candidate just because he's the main guy. He hasn't been in the best form, but he also had like a sick banger goal early on, like one of the best goals you'll see this year. And so if he's on, he also could be a candidate as well.
All right. Blake, what do you think?
Talked about it a lot on the show so far. It's, the midfield has left me just it this year. I mean, I've had so many midfielders score 3 to 6 points that it makes it hard for me to want to captain a midfielder at this point until I'm locked in and sure of what a guy is able to produce. Even players in super plus matchups have let me down the first 3 weeks. So I think I'm probably going to stray away from a midfielder until like I'm sure of who the guys are. And I'm still not sure. And I don't think any of us really are. We're starting to get an idea, but none of us really know. So my early inclination here is probably Christian Benteke against Montreal. Montreal, I think I've said it a couple of times on the Dropping Points podcast. They gave up like a goal to forwards in like 11 or 12 straight matches dating back to Leagues Cup last year. The first time that they haven't was this past weekend. They did not concede to a forward. They conceded to defenders for Vancouver. But Benteke is in form. He's playing against a team that is known to give up goals to strikers. If I can bet on a guy to score a goal, Benteke is probably the guy right now. If I had to bet the mortgage, I'm betting Benteke. And if I'm doing that, I'd probably captain him as well. So that's probably my safest pick. You go down the list of Brian's guys as well. Like I like all of those guys, but I think Benteke right now, if I just have to bet on a guy to score a goal and he'll be my forward, it's Benteke.
Yeah, and I agree. Since they changed like the formula for key passes last season, forwards by far are having a higher ceiling than midfielders. I mean, last season we got lucky with some really, really strong midfielders who were putting together strong, goal scoring, shot creating activities. And we still have those. It's just not near as like it was last season. And I was finding last season that forwards had a higher ceiling for the most part. And so I was captaining forwards. If I really like their matchup, Bouanga was a consistent one, across the board there. And so I think those players that get in the box, that are getting touches in the box, that can shoot, they're passing, they're creating chances, all that kind of stuff. Those are the guys that you really want to captain. We at Fantasy Boss will be putting up a video later on this week with our captain picks. I do want to touch on one thing before we let you go, guys. I really appreciate your time. We have not talked once about Lionel Messi. Is he in this week? Is he out this week? What do you guys think? I have my opinions. I'll let you guys go first. Blake, you want to start with your thoughts on Messi this week? Is he in? Is he out? What's up?
I don't care if he's in or out. Every problem that I had in Major League Soccer fantasy, MLS fantasy this week, all my dropping points that I'm going to touch on in tomorrow's episode on dropping points is because of Lionel Messi and how he screwed my budget, how I wasn't able to get Schulte because I wanted Oriano and Messi. And then it was just a ripple effect after that, just a domino effect. One domino fell, another domino fell, and then I started chasing losses. And every bad thing that happened to me in Major League Soccer fantasy this week was because I held on to Lionel Messi for way too long. To be honest with you, if you guys listen to our show, and Matt, if you've listened through most of our shows, like we talk very minimally about Messi. He is the name we do not speak. I don't.
But here, the thing is though, like if he's in the lineup, can you afford not? So here's always been my argument: can you afford not to have him? Because if he hits, he usually hits pretty big. If he's captained by 40% of the people who are playing, you're going to get left behind. So if he's in the lineup, can you afford not to have him? And at that point, can you afford not to captain him? That's the question.
So I'll interject here again. I think that
Sure. Yeah.
the reason I held on to him so long is because that exact thinking. Like if he plays, you have to have Messi. And it messed me up so bad that yesterday when I saw that he wasn't starting, I thought I pivoted to Suarez. I forgot to hit save on my lineup. So Messi stayed in my lineup all freaking weekend long. So like he messed everything up for me, or I messed it up for myself. But you have to. You have to. And even if you keep Messi, Messi doesn't play. If Suarez is in that lineup, I dropped the stat over on the MLS Gone Wild Twitter today that in the I think it's 11 games that Messi hasn't started and Suarez has started, Suarez has still produced 11 goals and 5 assists in that time. So like that's such an easy pivot over to Suarez. Um,
Sure.
it does suck this round because Miami is the last game. They were the second to last game this past week, so you had a few more options. But yeah, you have to plan to have him in your lineup as much as it sucks when he doesn't play and you have limited options. But like Suarez is the immediate fallback, and you have to have him or you are going to miss out.
Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you still have to keep him in mind. One of the reasons we don't talk about him on the show is also just because like we feel like there's not much to actually talk about. You need him in there. More likely than not, it's very difficult to not play him. I do think if obviously you don't have to play him if he's not starting, even if he's on the bench. I think I was one idea that floated in my mind is in case like there was a gamble that he could get in there and play because I mean if he gets in, he's almost sure that he's scoring. But if Suarez is in, you can also pivot to him. I do like Atlanta's forwards also, so I think you have a few other options to pivot to Atlanta's forward line if you're going to take a flyer at that point. I don't know about captaining him just because I mean I think you do have to keep him. I just having to wait that long for a captain when you have no other real captainable options at that point I do think is a significant risk. You just got to key in on the CCC game, but I feel like there's a chance that Messi doesn't play in Jamaica too. They're already up 2-0. It's kind of been like a trend where they kind of keep resting him for especially I don't know what kind of condition. I mean, they've talked about the conditions of fields in MLS that maybe Messi and these guys won't play in. So I can't imagine what the condition of the field is on this Jamaican squad. So I could see that he doesn't play just because of that, and but could throw things off going into this Atlanta matchup. But I mean, it for me, captaining him is tricky because if he doesn't start golly, does having him play as your captain is that golly that I mean that sucks. So I'm willing to look at other options for captaincy. I think we've touched on several just to at least
Mm-hmm.
try to cover some of those points. But I mean you have to at least probably keep him stashed just in case he goes. The Messi situation for fantasy purposes has become uh at one point, I was pretty frustrated by how, I mean, when he was playing regularly, because it was just like, okay, well, now it's kind of, you're playing like a 10-man game essentially instead of actually,
Yeah.
it kind of limited the amount of creativity you could play with. And now I'm almost like frustrated with it in a different way because it limits your creativity because you have to keep them in and then you have to rotate out and then kind of throw a pick at the wall. And so because of
Yeah.
all the Sunday games, ideally, eventually he gets to they just have Miami on a Saturday game, so you can kind of learn a little bit earlier
I
and
know.
around it. That's I think one of the other big issues is all of his games have been on Sunday so far, and it's
They want him on that prime time slot, I guess.
yeah, and so
So
it's really killing just your ability to kind of make adjustments earlier. If it was a Saturday game, and then we're not really talking about it at the 7:30 game, like if this is like a classic 7:30 window game on Saturday, it's not really that big of a factor. But it being the prime time Sunday night soccer game is like that's going to really eat people's lunch all week. And so I'm probably leaning towards playing him and then maybe looking for an alternative to captain and just maybe eat the risk because if he does start, I'm probably losing out on a decent amount of bonus points, but I'll still at least mitigate that by having him in my lineup, but at least trying to take a chance on, I mean, at least looking at it, depending on how the lineups play out as I continue to look at some of the numbers and some of these stronger options. I don't think I love captaining Benteke over like a Messi, even though he's been in good form, but like Benteke's floor is super low. So
Yeah.
that's the one downside to like captaining a Benteke, and then he doesn't score that goal that you need, and then Messi hits. That's a huge deviation. Whereas there's maybe some guys with a safer floor to help protect. But now we're getting into the weeds of like how to protect against all these different scenarios. And
Yeah.
at the end of the
All
day,
right. Yeah. Real quick. Yes or no? Is Messi playing in Atlanta?
I think he is. I think he is playing this week.
Blake.
No.
I don't think he is either. I think they're saving him for. I think he's saving for Argentina, but that's just my gut. I don't have any kind of info. That's what I think. But all right, guys. Well, let's wrap this up. Man, I loved talking to you guys. I really appreciate you guys being here. I love the show that you guys are doing and all the info that you're putting out there. I love the fact that we can kind of do it as a community together. And talk about this stuff and have fun and be sickos like we are. So any plugs? Blake, what's your plug?
Give me a follow. My personal profile on Twitter at Dropping Points. If you guys are interested in going back and listening to a bunch of old player reviews, I've had the likes of Kellen Acosta, Brendan Aronson, a bunch of the guys over in Charlotte, Aiden Morris. A lot of these guys have transferred out. A lot of the young guys over the past couple of years that are trying to make their name for themselves over in Europe. Tanner Tessman as well. You guys can go back and listen through that library of interviews that I did. I also am just on Twitter posting random stats that I usually find when I'm preparing for the Dropping Points podcast that Brian and I do every Wednesday. So you guys can give Brian and I a follow over there at Dropping Points. And then I'm sure Brian will plug it as well. But you guys can listen to our podcast anywhere that you guys listen to your favorite podcast, Apple, Spotify. We're Dropping Points. Give us a listen, follow us on Twitter, interact with us. We enjoy the community that is MLS Fantasy.
Brian.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Bam Mauer Media. You can find all my written content at topbin90.com. We cover Charlotte FC, cover MLS in general over there on the website and on our podcast, Top Bin 90 podcast. And then also, yeah, I do a thread on the Dropping Points on Saturday morning, looking at just the status report as it comes out, and I try to add some details based on kind of what ends up happening, and who's released, who's playing, who's out, who's questionable, and just kind of how that maybe changes the stock of different matchups and situations like that. So watch out for that thread. I usually kind of get that out Saturday mornings.
And I'll plug MLSFantasyBoss.com, weekly fantasy content. Guys, we are putting out daily content now just about every week. We've got a series of articles or fantasy rankings, all that kind of stuff, kind of picking up the slack from MLS Fantasy this season. So check that out at MLSFantasyBoss.com or visit our Discord community. All the top players are in there. Get your lineups rated, get questions answered, find out about injuries with our mega reference in our Discord community. That's where you can get all your questions answered and find out the best way to play throughout the season. So check that out. Thank you, everyone. We certainly do appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Have a great night.